what does it mean when, got it, hang on. So what does it mean to do less better in promoting well-being in schools? And note, I don't say just child here. It's also about our everyone that's in the building, whether it's the school leader, the school teacher, the custodian, the bus driver. We're all, I'm assuming you're experiencing many of the same things that we're experiencing here in Connecticut, where well-being is a challenge right now, and we're all working toward that. But doing less better is going to be a key to doing that. Then I want to jump into what does it mean to do a whole child, school, and community lens, and then think about and provide some opportunities for you to identify ways that you could apply that knowledge to strengthen the integration of efforts in your specific context or place. Fair enough? All right. You can't hear me anyway because you're muted, so we'll just keep going. And our first goal, what do we mean by doing less better? I first want to just set the stage by something that's really struck me that I heard Dana Bowen Matthews speak last February, I think it was. She's the law dean at George Washington University, and she wrote this book that was a book read for the National Association of School Psychologists. And in her talk, she said, health is affected by the work we do. Think about this. Health is affected by the work we do, and the work we do is affected by education. So think about that for a minute. She took a bunch of this content from this article that I cite here, which was proposing or propositioning that education is a fundamental social determinant of health. And in that paper, they argue that education is so critically important to everything that we do in life. And they give tons of statistics. It's really a fascinating paper. Stuff like, data showing that a man in the US with a graduate degree would be expected to live 15 years longer than someone who has a high school education. Think about that. And a dose response appears between years of education and many health-related behaviors. For example, if you have less than 9 years of formal education, there's a higher prevalence that you'll engage in risk behaviors. So if you pull all that together, and this book was on, health inequities, but they were centering education as one of the central pathways to how we change inequities in our society. And education, it serves to provide health knowledge, higher education that was just talked about, and also this really important psychosocial space, right? An environment where kids learn and grow. I'm not sure why my slides aren't going. There we go. So if our ultimate goal is to make sure that school is a positive education environment, we need to make sure that it's serving as an asset across positive life course. So in this picture, this is what we call a developmental cascade. And you can see the ways that things go around intergenerationally, to start over here with early childhood risks that are presented, and they come into school, and we can either head this way where we have nurturing relationships, we have increased regulation, great responses, relationships, good development, decreased risks, so on and so on, which then serves to feed intergenerationally more asset. Versus the other path is we come in, we have a kid that's really dysregulated, we don't have supportive interactions, we get continued escalation, negative responses, disengagement, disconnection, risk behaviors, and so on, that feeds an intergenerational cycle of continued problems. This is what we call a developmental cascade. And so David Osher said once, he talks about the goal of education is to minimize net vulnerability. So let me explain what that means for a second. We all have vulnerabilities, right? Each one of us comes with a different set of life experiences and life situations that present it with who we are. And our goal is to take those vulnerabilities and make them as small as possible, right? So we create assets, we produce assets that can reduce total vulnerability. That's what school is supposed to do for all of our kids. Does that make sense? So one of the things that I ask myself every day now, and I've been using this as a way to frame thinking about, how does doing X serve to contribute asset because some of the things we do in school do present risks. Some of the things that we do present assets, but it's uneven across different kids. And so one of our goals and one of the grounding things that we talk about when we present with our school leaders is to have in the back of your mind at every stage or space to think about, how does doing this contribute to reducing net vulnerability? How does it contribute an asset? Does that make sense? The problem that when we ask that question, though, or the problem with a lot of the practices and the policies and the things that we do in schools, and this is what's going to set up my stage for why I want to talk about whole school child and community, is that if we don't go back and understand the theory or the reason why something's working, why we've chosen to put this in place, you run the big risk of lack of sustainability, right? Poor implementation, sustainability, those are all challenges that Kent has talked about or that we've worked on. He's working on equity now too. I know he talked about that this morning. You know, we could look at alternatives to suspension and expulsion as a really quick example. We have lots of different options instead of suspending or expelling kids. The majority of those practices, or these alternative practices though, focus on a within-person focused intervention, like teaching students skills, restoring relationships after a problem behavior, addressing biases, or teacher cultural responsiveness. It's not that those alternatives are bad, they're all great in and of itself. But if we disconnect it from understanding why it is, the why of the work or why they're working, and then how you take like that standard intervention and integrate it with attention to your culture and your context, you can inadvertently end up with not contributing to that net vulnerability for every child or creating risk. A lot of my time, I use this as an example, but I live most of my time actually in the Upper Valley region between Vermont and New Hampshire. So in the White River Junction type of area. And it's fascinating to me that you can have this, what they call the Upper Valley region, which is supposed to be these like 5 towns that are all together. Yet there's a state line that divides them. And each of the communities and the different issues that they struggle with are very different. So taking the same idea and putting it into place doesn't lead to the same outcomes. And so that's my quick example of where I situate myself in thinking about what is the purpose of education and why is it so critical that we be an asset to kids in the way they go, in the way they grow, not go. Guiding actions to doing better, doing less better, means doing fewer things, not more things. So how do we serve as an asset to child vulnerability? Grounds all the decisions, but when we do a few highly effective actions really well, we can avoid the temptation of doing more than is doable. And right now in particular, I'm not sure what's happening necessarily in Maine, but doing more of the same isn't working, and adding more things onto what we were already doing is not working either. We're seeing some of the other ends of things falling apart. So a better normal approach to where we're going needs to be scientifically founded, but also contextually and culturally responsive. And we need to be able to make decisions about how do we do things less, but better. And I'm going to give you some examples of that, and then we'll go on from there. So in that article that Courtney had suggested, which I think the link is in the PowerPoint slides, George and I talked about 4 things in particular. And each of these, if you look at them as a whole, helps us contribute asset to that child's net vulnerability. Most of these things are things that Kent worked on with you this morning. Doing a high probability of what works well for specific contexts. So how do you create it in a way that fits for your school? How do you catch problems early, promotion and prevention? How are you point positive? I think I came in right when he was talking about that. How are you teaching positively to learn? All of those things are super important. But here's my example. Take a look at this mean and tell me what you think when you look at the right side and the left side. Just stop for a minute, put some comments in the chat. Anybody smiling? Quiet smiles? Any smiley faces? All right, somebody chuckled. The pictures are the same, yes, but the messages are different. They look cozy. Great. So one of the things that's worrying me a lot right now, it's all in how you look at it. Yeah, those are great. Keep the comments coming while I talk. Is this idea of emotional safety, right? We're all very anxious right now as a society, as an individual, as a group. We have a lot of anxiety, and that should be normal. It should be expected given the things that we're dealing with and the circumstances that are happening, both for the children that we care for and ourselves as the adults who are caring for them. The problem is becoming, though, when those fears or those worries prevent us from being able to navigate our everyday life. And so there was a wonderful study that came out just this summer in American Psychologist that was basically telling us that as a whole, the landscape of the COVID-19 pandemic has elevated anxiety and depression in our general adult population. Again, not unexpected, but yet also kind of reaffirming that the data are also showing nationally adults are experiencing anxiety and depression. But those most at risk, which I think was interesting, were our females, younger in age, and those with pre-existing mental health challenges. The article then goes on to say that one of the best predictors of how well you're handling kind of this emotional turmoil that we're experiencing is how well you tolerate uncertainty, what kinds of positive coping strategies you use, such as seeking social supports, positive reframing, humor, and acceptance. So here we come with my meme, and I'm going to give you another one in a second. So just this week, I read another study that basically talked about how using COVID humor, COVID-specific humor, it's a really cool study. I also have the link in, I think, my slides, has been found to show very positive outcomes. We know humor works. When we laugh, the power of a threat to create emotional stress poofs, right? We feel physiologically more calm. We're able to cope and experience positive emotion. And so what was interesting to me about this particular study was that this was a study where they compared people that got just the cats on the left and the cats on the right. And the key findings were that you can experience stress-busting benefits of humor while minimizing the emotional toll of the pandemic. So the COVID-specific memes or humor pieces were actually more helpful, again, if they were culturally appropriate and appropriate for your context. And that when you viewed memes like this, you're more confident in your coping and you thought more deeply about content. And that if you viewed this funny stuff, you actually feel more connected to others. So I stopped for a second and I thought, well, what other kind of COVID humor is that out there? Because I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to it. And I found lo and behold, here's 87 coronavirus and quarantine jokes to retrain your face to smile. And I picked out a couple that made me chuckle. So what do you think about these? Take a look. I see more chuckles, right? And I could see definite connections to teaching, right? In the classroom environment and the ways that you could use these, or the ways you could create opportunities for kids to share them or come up with their own, and of course vet them, which is part of being responsible decision-making about what's appropriate and what's not. But these made me laugh and I did feel a lot better. And it is a pandemic, right? That's kind of what they were saying there at the bottom. My point in sharing a lot of this is that this is a very simple strategy, right? It didn't take a lot of work. It used science-based techniques to provide a promotion-based strategy for emotional wellness, and has great applications or great potential for you to think about how do you incorporate that into my staff meetings. Again, if you go through those 87 coronavirus pandemics, you wouldn't use them all in the classroom. Don't get me wrong on that. But there are some you might use for staff meetings, some you might use in classrooms, some may not be appropriate depending on the context or this classroom in which you live. the issue is that the summary message, or why I digress and share that with you, is that if you look on the left, the things you should be doing have to be done with attention to what we call usability as well. And so this ISO here is this International Organization for Standardization. They're the internationally agreed upon experts for everything, like that create the formulas for how you describe something or how you do something. Could be a product, a process, or something. Think about food safety, camera speed, film speed. Remember those days, right? Even event and time and day formats are all established by the ISO. And the ISO, one of the guiding principles they use is this thing called usability. If you're going to create a new product, it has to be easy to use, right? It has to be easy to use, it has to be effective, and people have to be satisfied with the way you use it. And so a lot of what my work is doing now is focusing back on doing less better should be driven by the key principles of what we're shooting for on the left, but also key features of usability. And so the examples that I gave you just a minute ago in humor are agnostic of a specific framework, program, or initiative, right? But it's a simple strategy used to focus on what we would term in developmental pathways, the social, emotional, and behavioral directions. So the social, how we connect with each other, emotional, how we feel, and behavioral, how we act. These are developmental pathways that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes that we want all kids to grow and flourish in doing. And they all fall under the umbrella of what I would call positive education. It's a whole lot of ranges of theories and frameworks and lots of different things, but the focus is on promotion of student well-being overall, positive relationships as its foundation, and proactive problem solving in taking an issue and figuring out the most usable and simple way that we can create a way to solve the problem. Before I move on, though, I do want to this is not the talk for today, and I really debated about it because I'd really rather talk about emotional well-being because I do think it's critical right now. But I did put in there's a folder called Emotional Well-being Resources. If that's helpful to you, there are a couple of worksheets and a couple of brief reports on these kinds of things, like simple strategies like humor for being able to strengthen the foundation of emotional well-being. So I just want to bring your attention to that and move on from there. Because that was just my example for today. So the issue, let me just go back. Well, no, I won't go back. So the issue with positive youth development or positive education is that we've shifted the way we think about problems, right? We've shifted the way we address them. We focused on positive framing and positive ways of doing it. Yet I'm arguing that we haven't really reached the full potential for it to advance equity in education, because we have to do a better job of integration within a whole school, whole child, school, and community space. So this slide just sets that up to say there isn't a quick fix to doing less better in a way to advance equity. Because what happens is, we get our boards of education or our superintendents working on policy, or states, right, that focus on policy that reinforces exclusionary discipline. So we put policies in place in the 1990s. Everybody been around long enough like me to know the zero tolerance policies were a way to stop bad behavior in school, right? And then in 2020, in this generation, we're saying, okay, well, you can't, no exclusionary discipline, like that's outlawed because we know that's bad practice and that's not leading to good outcomes. But if we put that in place and we disconnect it from then, well, what do we do instead? We have a problem with our neglecting attending to what we're actually doing. Then in the middle box, or the red box, if we focus only on using evidence-based programs, so PBIS is great, right? It creates a great staff structure, positive teaching, reinforcing desired behaviors. But what the work that they're working on now, and Kent showed you this morning quite a bit, is how to then make it be congruent with culture, right? How do we take what we know and make sure that it fits and aligns with your culture and your context? SEL is a great example as well, evidence-based opportunity to teach essential skills. But the original SEL focus was really on the teaching the student in the absence of thinking about it again as a student deficit perspective, something we needed to do for students rather than this systems-wide thinking of how does it all fit together. My final example is trauma-informed. I love trauma-informed stuff, but the work to date has really focused on building awareness and empathy, but we now need to connect it again to culture, context, and then the understanding that relationships serve as the foundation or the root. So we can put those programs in place. I digressed a little bit there, but if we then don't prioritize how those practices look within our setting, how do we understand mechanisms of change? What are the features of implementation? What are the features of contextual fit? If we do just one without the other, we don't end up with the outcomes that we're looking for in contributing asset in equitable ways to reducing net vulnerability that kids present. That was a lot of background, so I'm going to stop there and move on to that's the whole setup for what I mean by a whole child school and community lens. I'll jump into this one next. We'll look to see if you have any questions, but if not, we'll just get going. I think so. The work that I've been doing lately has really moved to shift to this idea of integrated theory. So in order to do less better, we have to pull back from thinking about specific things or even frameworks, and we have to lead our decisions. Our decisions need to be led in an integrated approach, in an integrated way, so that we can better set ourselves up in setting the stage to advance equity. Whole child really comes from developmental systems approach. And, this has been around for over 50 years. I don't know if anybody can put in the chat if you want, has ever heard of Dr. James Comer and the school development program out of the Yale University and the work that he's done in New Haven. But over 50 years ago, James Comer talked about championing, say that 10 times fast, the nurturing of the whole child through developmental relationships, no blame, consensus, and collaboration. And that's really the foundation to that, to whole child. Whole school is where we get our prevention science and our MTSS structures that you're super familiar with. So I won't belabor on that. We'll look at each of those again in a few minutes. And then we need to wrap all of that with whole community, which is really our ecological systems framework, understanding that schools are critically important, but they're part of many microsystems involved in child's lives and are very contextually different. And we also look here at implementation science and what are the steps and the processes that we need to do to get something to be sustained. Because sometimes they're very different based on where we are in an initiative. Let's start just a couple slides on each, just on delving a little bit more into each of these. So a whole child approach is really a developmental systems approach. The big question of the day in education is, how do we define successful educational outcomes? We're swinging the pendulum, I guess, a bit more from the past 2 decades of focusing on ed policy reform, focused on academic indicators as the defining features of what we mean by student success. We're increasing, we've had academic indicators as driving what we mean by achievement for students of color, poverty, English language learners, disabilities. We had No Child Left Behind in 2001, gave us initial praise for calling attention to achievement gaps. But the resulting narrowing focus on reading and math test scores, coupled with the punitive school accountability in the 90s that we just talked about, didn't get us where we wanted to go. So now we're starting to see that pendulum, or the discussions about integrating the science of development and learning to overhaul everything that we're doing. It's all being kind of pretty much called the whole child approach in education. My point in bringing it up, though, is that it's not new. It's something that we had about 50 years ago, or the roots to it were planted over 50 years ago by Dr. Comer. And he is actually an MD. And when he was going about doing some of his residency training, he realized he needed to shift focus to schools rather than healthcare, because he thought that schools provide a universally accessible setting in which there are enough adults available to promote development across pathways. And I gave this talk once, and I think somebody sent me an orchid after. I'm not expecting this. So I start with an apology to any master gardeners that are out there by saying, we think about kids as a tree branch metaphor. So to understand how kids grow, we have different pathways and different branches. It's like different branches on a tree. And branches aren't supposed to grow evenly over time, right? Those master gardeners that are out there, branches aren't supposed to grow evenly over time. They grow also in different directions. But what we need to do is have foundationally dependent, or how that grows is foundationally dependent on nurturing to get the branches to grow in the way that we want the tree to look like in the end. And so that's a lot of what Comer was talking about across these developmental pathways that he lays out. And his terms are on the right there, the 6 terms that he originally used 50 years ago and continues to use. The terms we use are on the left, just physical, academic, social, emotional, behavioral. The Learning Policy Institute's Whole Child movement uses those terms. The Aspen Commission uses the middle terms. The idea is that they're all similar, right? In saying that a child is more than one single pathway, that nurturing well-being requires us to look and be part of growing the branches in the ways that we want to see them across many different ways. When you talk to early childhood people, right? If there's anybody in here from early childhood, they're like, duh, we knew that, we know that. But somehow in the early childhood transition later on, we somehow forget about all of the different pathways that need to be there. And that's what Comer most recently, he's well into his 80s now, and he wrote this wonderful commentary just last year in response to something where he talks about we've forgotten about development somehow, right? Like we need to have our schools be focusing on thinking about whole child development. And the question is, so how do we get back to our roots in fueling at the foundation developmental relationships, developmentally appropriate relationships? And that's what we mean by a whole child approach. Relationship is defined as the foremost active ingredient in how we get those pathways to go. There are multiple pathways that make a whole. Does that make sense? So the next wave of what we're doing does have to think about integrating. And my example, I guess, just as a personal example, I would say, when I show you the whole school child model later, the whole child space, to me, I went, oh my gosh, how many mistakes did I make as a school psychologist who's an expert in social emotional behavioral spaces, right? You give me a problem and we can build you the best intervention plan possible. But I wasn't necessarily thinking about how the work I was doing in my pathways influenced or intersected with other ones, or that maybe my strategy was nurturing the wrong pathway at a time. So quick example could be something like maybe a physical intervention, a physical health intervention could have had the same outcomes or better outcomes than some of my behavior plans that I built. And just think about that for a second. I can think of a couple of kids and a couple of examples. So one of the activities that I have that's in the work, the drive for you, if you want to use it, and what we've used with some of our school leaders in Connecticut when we pull people together, and we always put them in across ages and grades. So we put a high school principals in with our elementary principals in with our early childhood, is we do just a pathway priority discussion. What does this all mean? What does a whole child mean? Particularly in the past 18 months, where we've shifted lots of our thinking to the social emotional space. And then also how do we considering equity in those different pathways. So that's just a little worksheet if you want to use it, or if you find it useful. When we get into MTSS, we can skip this part because y'all know this stuff about what are we trying to do in the way we organize our services in schools. What I want to push on with that, though, is that these are Google done about 8 months ago or so. I just Googled a whole bunch of school districts and pulled what they have as their plans off or their pictures off their website. What strikes me in all of these and most of these is the lack of integration, though, the divorce or the separation from a whole child perspective. So we're doing great work in thinking about how do we tier our services to make sure that kids' needs are met in specific areas. But how are we doing that crossover space? So that's parallel, it's not integrated. Not that that's bad, again, but it's not where we really want it to be. So when we talk about intervention integration, what we really want is to see both across and within levels. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what that looks like. Across and within, and then expanding that across developmental pathways as well. So if we talk about intervention integration, we can go across levels. So there's different levels of need. This is what we're more commonly familiar with, right? The goal is to maximize the impact of an intervention for different groups that are at risk. And the added benefit is that you get repeated exposure. So in our really simple example, you can see on the left, we have our school-wide PBIS expectations. School-wide PBIS expectations are cut across all of the levels, right? So everybody from green to red is working towards school-wide behavior expectations. But kids that maybe aren't responding or aren't in the green might have check-in, check-out added, which reinforces school-wide expectations and provides other opportunity or tier 2 way of thinking about intensifying those supports. But we still have school-wide behavioral expectations flowing through the background. And then the same goes on when we talk about function-based interventions or FBIs. So that's what we mean about intervention integration across different levels. Now let's look within level. It's one level of need. So this is an example I stuck kind of somewhere in the yellow. The goal is to maximize impact for the risk that's been identified. And my best example of that would be something like we already have check-in, check-out plugging along. It fits with our school-wide behavior expectations. Maybe we also now need to add or want to add CBITs. So maybe we need to address symptoms of trauma, and we need some coping skills and teaching of new skills that we can get through a cognitive behaviorally based intervention that's done in small groups in schools. So maybe we're doing check-in, check-out with CBITs to intensify or strengthen what we're trying to do and within that level. Where we really want to go and where we're trying to go is to get to the point where we're across and within levels. An integrated approach to implementing tiered systems of support in schools is where we get, oh, did I miss what CBITS is? One second. Equity in schools. CBITS is cognitive behavior intervention training in schools. It's a tier 2 school-based trauma intervention. Maybe don't use it in Maine so much. I don't know if you have other ones. Bounce back, CBITS, match, ADT are some of the examples that we have. Some districts do use it. Okay. So it's basically for kids who have been identified. Yeah, and you can learn a lot freely online actually about CBITS. In Connecticut, we've got some different grants for districts to be able to put it into their buildings with some outside agency helps as well. So it's kind of the bigger program that we use here. But it's evidence-based for kids who have high impairment on different trauma scores. Sorry for that not specific example, but so what we want to do is get to the point where we can integrate across and within different domains. So if we think about, let's take a physical example of school meals as an example that we're going to add in with our developmental pathways and see where we have maybe we do have CBITS and check-in, check-out going along, but we also need to be thinking about, well, what is the food insecurity issue that's happening, and how do we make sure that we intensify through extra meals, extra snacks, school backpack programs, whatever it is you're working on and doing. That's what we're trying to do when we can do, I don't know if you've heard the word or if it's just kind of coming into its timeline of IMTSS or integrated MTSS, is a way to enhance what we're doing. The structures of MTSS are excellent. It's grounded in everything we need to know about how we deliver our services. But what we need to do next is put that tree right within it. And the way that we do that is like one simple picture somebody always argues with me like, well, you didn't put this word in here, or you didn't add this word. And I said, well, my graphic designer was already telling me I had to reduce words. So in our collaboratory on school and child health, we talk about weaving of those developmental pathways. That's what you see is that spine in the middle. So we have academic, social, emotional, behavioral, physical. And then we talk about the resources and the examples that we see in school across those different tiers. And we also have community examples that we use to be sharing examples of what we mean by integrated tiered delivery of services. You could take this blank form and fill out your own in terms of thinking about how that looks like, what it looks like in your community or in your context, and how you can think about strengthening or posting, sorry, got distracted by the chat at the same time, how you could strengthen those opportunities to connect within community about the things that are out there. I'm going to give you one really quick example, and then we're just going to keep on moving to implementation, then we'll get to some of my examples. And I made this example probably a couple of years ago, and I use it when I do presentations, and it actually came true to me last night. So I'll explain that, or Wednesday night, I'll explain that to you. So when we're talking about moving from siloed to integrated, here's an example. The number one thing that I used to get phone calls about is anxiety, student anxiety. What do we do about student anxiety? And so a typical example of what we might do is have separate or siloed efforts where maybe the PE health education staff redesign the 2-year health PE correct curriculum. I'm not sure how yours is done there. And they put some extra lessons in the health ed curriculum around mental health and strengthening mental health. Then we have student services folks like me out there planning options for those tier 2s and tier 3s. So the one-to-one supports for students having anxiety. Those requests, though, are done separately, and the training isn't really integrated or connected. So what you have, in effect, is you've got these silos around different areas that you're connecting in whole child well-being, but they're separate. On the right-hand side, a coordinated or an integrated example could be putting your staff together to talk about what are we going to do? How can we make this plan? Maybe the PE health ed teacher faculty work with student services to design a unit that could be embedded together. And then we add families as partners to support the generalization of that strategy. And then we use our school nurses. I don't know about you, but my middle child was a frequent flyer to the school nurse, not because she was physically ill, because of her tummy troubles, but she tended to be a bit more anxious. So maybe we engage our school nurses to help us do surveillance, to identify and refer those who might need more support. And we do it in a coordinated way. And so we put those bullets or those gears together in a way that is more integrated and coordinated. Somebody says, I don't think we have enough family engagement in our MTSS. Great, something to work on, Meg, put it on your list. And I heard Kent talk about that a little bit this morning as part of a direction to moving toward equity. And this is what I would say. And so I made this example up. I'm going to tell you right off, I made it up, but I honestly tell you on Wednesday night, I sit on a local school board foundation and we had a board meeting, and I came out of the meeting with my friend who is a health PE teacher in the district. And she was lamenting to me that the district had hired a new school wellness coordinator as part of the recovery funds to do all of these things, but that nobody had reached out to the health and PE people to talk about how do we integrate and communicate in strengthening the way that they were all working in social emotional wellness. And so it's a real example. Now I can say it's actually a real example. Happens all the time. Yes, we put the health people on one side and we put the education people on the other side. And I haven't quite figured out, well, that's one of the things that we're doing is trying to figure out how do we not have those silos out there. I think I was once told that like about 3 or 4 years ago, when I was talking originally about some of my ideas, I was doing it with a bunch of PE directors, athletic directors, PE health directors. And somebody said, you know, that meditation stuff y'all are talking about, you know, in mental health, in the mental health world, we've been teaching that stuff forever. Mindfulness, meditation, nobody ever asked us. And I thought that was weird at the time, but I actually don't think it is weird. As Sarah is telling us, it happens all the time. All right, I know, let's see. Okay, we're doing okay. So the very last part is this idea of whole community. And so to really be able to establish equitable school environments also requires that we connect beyond the immediate school. And so family engagement is a great example of how do we connect these whole child goals across setting and context. If we do that, we're going to be able to bolster sustainability of efforts and maximize outcomes, certainly, but also bolster sustainability. So this ecological implementation that I call it, or whole community, really combines the idea of looking at the ecological framework and implementation science. So the ecological systems framework brings emphasis to the interactions within and across that influence systems, influence outcomes across generations. And implementation science bolsters our capacity to take those really great practices that we've decided are a good fit for us and put them into place. I'm going to move just to this really quickly because this just came out this summer, and it was interesting to me. There was a bunch of these implementation researchers pulled together this kind of book, and some of the case studies in there are interesting, but it was all focused on equity and implementation, and really good stuff. But again, what I looked at on the right side was this one picture that I gave you a snip about, or a snip from, a snip from, is that all of the words that I see in here around what does it mean to equitably implement something are the same words that we see in whole child, right? Developmental systems, relationships as the foundation, the need to do no blame cross systems communication. So I define community or whole community as merging what we're trying to do in ecological systems and implementation science framework to engage in cross-system strategies. It was probably a couple of years ago that we were doing a trauma symposium across the whole state, and there was this really wonderful social worker in the room, and we had posed a question for discussion and challenge, and he just looked up at everybody and he said, really the big problem is that the waves come and go. And we said, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Well, the waves come and go in education. People change all the time, administrators change, the initiatives change, the priorities change based on who is in the different leaders. So my job in my school that I've been now in for a long time is just to kind of figure out how to ride those waves. So how do we ride the waves in a way that allows us to keep true to what we're doing with the mission of education, which is really to nurture that whole child. And so I thought about that a lot, and I was like, that's really interesting. Because even in like PBIS and some of the work that Kent has done, they've noted that different factors may be more or less important at different stages of implementation. So for example, I don't know if Kent talked about this morning or not, in one of their evaluations in PBIS, when you're starting up in PBIS, you need to have administrator support, high fidelity, and staff buy-in. You know that, you've practiced that. But if you want to get to sustainability, some of the factors that they were finding were not the same. They were more focused on district support and parent involvement. So I was like, that's really interesting. And it falls in line with the idea of ecological implementation. When we ingrain something and we root it more strongly in either policy. I have a good friend that works in policy stuff with me, and her big space is around food policy. And she says, if you put it in policy, whoever's in the building, next is the next district administrator or whoever it is, or school board. If it's a policy, you have to figure out how you at least minimally meet those requirements. That was an interesting perspective. Anyway, I digress, and I just want to move on for a second. So one of the ways that I structure my thinking about what does ecological implementation look like is I use this thing called a congruence model. It actually comes from business. So the MTSS triangle gives us a really good way to think about how we intensify our services. The implementation, though, or the nuts and bolts part of it, entails working within the systems to get it moving. And so I'm going to give you an example. Let me just read through this for you, and we'll get through this as an example. We have what we're trying to do on the left, so the strategy. We need to mix that or merge that all together to get to the outcomes we want on the right with the work. So that's the task, whether it's the instruction, the curriculum, the support task. We have the structure. So who defines and provides the resources? We have the people, who's responsible for actually doing the work. And then we have culture. So what are the informal and formal structures? The willingness to change our practice, the attitude toward a practice. And so let me give you a concrete example, because I know it can be a little bit complex, but let's say that we set a district improvement goal to prioritize employee wellness as part of a state initiative around employee physical health. So the district leadership, the structure, sets up the improvement goal in employee wellness, physical health, but then we need to evaluate what the strategies, what the actual work is that the individual schools have in place to understand what's going to be a goodness of fit across the strategy, employee, and the culture. So for example, elementary A, the school staff might say that they can't meet their daily exercise goals, their daily physical activity goals. So we acknowledge those efforts, and we build the strategies that engage student and physical health as well, student and family wealth, to create a connection for building school wellness strategies. School staff agree that the goal of increasing daily physical movement minutes, they identify options that can provide fit within the current work schedule. Walking club, joining student mileage club, creating team challenges, participating in family school community events, dance-a-thons, individual staff interests. School leaders then put those resources in place to implement the activities that have been decided on by that culture, and off they go. And then they give information about the staff physical goal and shared with families, and how you can then generalize and extend that. So in that example, which I kind of flubbed through because I think my dogs are coming home today right now, not only did so I apologize if you're barking. So not only did the district plan with alignment in mind versus like just this is what you're going to do, go do it. So they took steps to allow each school to decide how it would look congruent in their setting. And then we're going to go from there. We'll stop and see if you have any chat questions while we walk through some of the example materials that we have. I got about 10 minutes, I think, then we'll open to questions that can help you think about what this might look like in your school. Don't see any chat, so I'm going to keep going. So it's a long way of saying that I have been a school psychologist for a really long time. I train future school psychologists. And what I've realized in the past kind of 6 or 7 years is that I can do a better job if I partner better, partner differently, partner strategically in ways that could advance a whole child's success. And so at UConn, we've created this, this project, we'll call it the Think About the Link project, that helps us, helps schools and helps families think about how do we connect all of these gears together? How do we strengthen what it is we're doing? Because we're doing great stuff. We're doing good stuff, but we could do it better and be more efficient in what we're doing if we were able to put things together. And I woke up one day, I think it was around 2014, 2015, when I first saw this model that was presented by the CDC. It's an expansion of their coordinated school health model. I don't know if anybody's on the call that does coordinated school health or has that space. Where, in the middle is our child. So that's our developmental pathways, and we need kids to be healthy, safe, supported, challenged, engaged, all that great stuff. The blue stuff is what's most interesting to me because it's 10 components that interact together and reciprocally in different ways to get to the green. That's a good question, Charles. We're going to come to that in a second. And the only way that we can actually really get to the green is if we coordinate our policies, our processes, and our practices. The same thing that I've just talked about in terms of integrated child, school, and community spaces. And I love the fact in their old coordinated school health model, they didn't have employee wellness, but this was added in the most recent, which I think is most critical. At least that's definitely what we're seeing in my communities near me. employee wellness is really the gate right now that we need to tackle to getting our schools up and running to do the whole child work that we want to do. Anyway, we take the whole school model and we wrap that around in community. So this is the model of shifting perspectives from separate to integrated. And so the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts. We talk about them as gears. So each of those blue pieces in their wheel, we take as gears, and we kind of talk about how they interact together. So as one example, I'm just going to do this really quickly. There is an activity in your sheet called Exploring Context. If you're not familiar with all of those blue gears, you can engage in this exercise to look at what is the definition. Think about how familiar you are with that. Do you need to know more about it? And then most importantly, who in your school has that expertise? Because sometimes folks can't really, sometimes they can very quickly. I mean, I've seen it with some of my school team leaders when we're in there, and they go through and they can do a map in like 5 minutes. And sometimes they really have to talk about it a little bit more, or if I put like a pupil services director in the room with a food services director, they may not have even talked all year long, but may have very similar goals that they're trying to reach in those conversations. So having just an exploring your context and gaining familiarity is one way that we think about walking through an activity to help you to become more familiar with what's out there. And so really what we're trying to do is, when we talk about that integrated MTSS and that like whole child, putting it into the triangle, what we're really trying to do is put the circle into the triangle in the services and the supports that we provide. And we do that by planning for equitable, sustainable implementation in the waves that come and go. We've broken, and we're still working on many of the pieces to this, because again, it shouldn't be complex, and we need to make it not complex so that we can do less better. But it is a challenge to get all the things up. But we talk about it as the 3 E's to congruence. And so we have this idea of exploring context, establishing directions, and evaluating directions and establishing actions. And so one of the things that we also have are these practice guides. So in the last exercise, you looked at how you could look at a quick definition of what a gear is, and then think about who does that in your school and what's the familiarity. We also have these things called evidence-informed practice briefs. They're 4-pagers, no more than 5, but usually 4, where each one of those gears has one, where we went out and did all the work to define what it looks like. And the second page is why it's important. What are all the outcomes that have been linked to enhancing behavior supports, which is down here. The third page is usually what we call if we were going to pick the top 6 evidence-informed strategies, what would they be and why are they important? What would they look like? And then the last page is where can I go to learn more about it? So these practice briefs are where we get most of our downloads or interest in terms of just being able to think through and what are the things that we're doing in our school and how can we show, how do we promote use of positive behavior supports? This is the PBIS conference, so I'm assuming that we could, you do really, really well on that. Strengthening universal mental health promotion. Maybe that's something that you want to work in, I don't know, or not. So the second tool that we have in terms of evaluating where you want to go with your work is this activity called evaluating directions. So you take those briefs and you read them through and you kind of think about what that looks like in your school. And then you go through and you do a little evaluation of, okay, these are the kinds of things that we're doing at different levels to meet this promoting positive behavior support practices. I'm going to give myself a 3. So we'll just keep doing what we're doing. But maybe, a couple of these in here, we have a 2 or a 1. And those are things that we want to evaluate directions for strengthening. Okay, so that's our activity there. Our last activity, and I know we're definitely coming up on time, so I'm going to get through this super quick, is one where we, again, analyze the congruence. So now let's say that on that prior worksheet that we defined that we need to strengthen in a particular area. the question then becomes, well, what are we going to do? And how are we going to do it? So the congruence activity is really, I'm going to go to the next page just so you can see it, where you define what it is you're considering doing. You haven't done it yet. Sure, Courtney, thank you. I just want to make sure we get through our time. You define the strategy being considered, and you do a little evaluation about how it fits. Context, the structure, the culture, the work, and the people, all those things that I showed you in that little blue model. And then you come up with an eventual decision of, is this something we want to do? So I would argue that things like incorporating humor strategies, appropriate humor for your context, is a really low-hanging fruit. It's really easy to do with evidence-based support behind it to strengthen universal mental health promotion, particularly emotional wellness. Other things like big programs or curriculum or initiatives, like maybe those are going to take a little more time for you to go through and think about how do we want to put, I don't want to list a specific program. So I'm just not going to do that. Think about something you've been thinking about, some trauma-informed something, CBITS, just because some people are using CBITS, some things aren't. Should we use CBITS in our school? That'd be a good example of, boy, if we want to do something that's a tier 2 trauma-informed intervention, can we do this? Are we ready? What would it take? That's an example we'll go with. So that's my examples, kind of rushing there toward the end a little bit about what I mean about an integrated theory, by meaning using integrated theory to understand that the foundation of everything that we're doing in education is to be an asset, contribute asset to child net vulnerability. And we do that when we don't think about specific things, we think about whole child, school, and community lens, and how does it inform the choices that we're making. Doing less better pulls us back from specific policy, specific program, specific practice to lead those decisions through an integrated lens. And that's, I think, what will set the stage to advancing equity in education grounded in answering, how does doing this serve to contribute an asset to net vulnerability? It's complex, it's messy, but I do fundamentally believe that if I had been using integrated theory to drive the decisions that I was doing, it's possible to do less more, if that makes sense. And so I know I just saw somebody put that into the Think About the Link project link. You can go to our CSCH website. I will say that most of the activities that I posted in here are not publicly out yet. So you have them as we're testing and developing and using them under the process space. But what you can find are the practice guides. We have little short 5-minute videos on each of the domains, each of the gears. We also have those briefs up there for each of the 10 domains. If you're a policy person, we've got a wonderful tool called the WellSat WISC that will guide you through doing policy evaluation in each of those domains, or the whole thing, which it would be a little overwhelming. We definitely hear from some of our folks, like maybe you want to work on your social emotional policies. So you work just in that section. Then we also have, which we'll be launching this year too, you can do the policy evaluation, but then we also have what's called the WellSat WISC I, which is like an interview tool to allow you to go in and see how well that policy is aligned with your practice. Most of the time we find that folks are doing more practices than the policy would suggest, and in which case we've worked with our districts to kind of develop ways to think about should this, or how would this go into your policy? Should you strengthen your policy? Do you need to strengthen your practice? Is everything a gold star? Or do we need growth in both areas? How do you have access to all of that? All of the policy tool, we just launched it in an online format. So you can download the hard copies if you want, but we also have an online platform. It's publicly available. The practice guides are all publicly available. The process blueprint, we're still working on getting it all put together, but many of the activities that I've shared with you today are some of the things that you'll see in there. And the content that I've talked about today about using a whole child, school, and community approach is what it's founded on, if that makes sense. and it's agnostic to any specific program or initiative. Again, this is just, the intent is to create tools to help you think about strengthening integration of your work. It's your decision to make, to decide what fits best for your context and which spaces. I don't know if that's a good enough answer, but it is 2:06, so I will stop there and take questions or comments. Yes, Courtney says district leadership teams, some of our school-based teams. If anybody's interested, I should pitch this too. In looking at that WellSat WISC tool, we actually have a student doing her dissertation right now on the usability of the tool. So if anybody wanted to get on and do a cognitive interview with my student Katie to help us think about how do we strengthen that tool, let me know, and we'll send her your way. And let me see, what else was I going to say? I think that's it. Yeah, those, my last slide would be, again, it would be helpful to me if you could write down 1 to 2 ways, while you're listening to folks that might have questions in chat, write down 1 to 2 ways that you might be able to follow up on the content that I provided here today, because I know it was a lot to throw at you, whether it be simply looking at the folder on emotional well-being, simple strategies and some tip sheets, whether you could implement that, or whether or not you want to move toward thinking about how do I follow up on thinking about my policies in my district, or how do we think about, how do I talk to that health and PE teacher that maybe I haven't talked to. Maslow. Yeah, Maslow's important in there too. I don't know that that was my driving thought in thinking about it. It really did come from a whole child Comer way of thinking about. Charles is asking me, how do you identify which part of the whole child is in need? A lot of that is very contextually and individually driven, right? Depending on the communities that you're in. So how do you decide that? I think that's, again, part of what you're doing in your school building team when you're making plans. I guess I would think, like, again, I'm thinking about my own failures, to be perfectly honest, and the things that I did over time that maybe, again, didn't really use a whole child approach, and thinking about how do we engage more with families in deciding what's needed in this situation. I'm kind of talking all around here, so I'm going to stop there and see if there's another question. Family engagement, yes. Community, family. Got it. Which part of the whole child is in need? I mean, most of the time when I did my evaluations and we sat on those teams, we checked with the nurse to see if they needed vision and hearing screening. Oftentimes we had a para that ran like a hygiene closet. So sometimes we would do those types of things. But I can think really specifically of examples where I think an antecedent physical health, physical activity intervention would have probably done the exact same outcomes as my behavior plan. Does that make sense for some of my kiddos? And maybe you're doing that already. Yeah, sounds similar to the questions we ask in our RTI meetings. I'm going to stop the share so I can see your faces better, unless somebody wants me to go back to something. Explain which part, Charles? Explain. And somebody tell me if I missed anybody else's comments. Does anybody want to share the 1 or 2 ways they are thinking that they might follow up on some of these materials? Sure, Courtney says it's a good way to think about bringing community agencies to the table. I have a really great partnership with someone who's an executive director down in New Haven, Connecticut, who's really honestly schooled me a lot on some of the things that I hadn't thought about coming from education. And I very much appreciated the collaborative partnerships that I've been able to have. Explain how to identify the whole child when implementing interventions. Oh, sure. So, well, can somebody also share the folks that are talking about when you're doing your RTI meetings? What might be some questions that you would ask in a different way, or are you asking now that would think about child supports across developmental pathways rather than just the presenting problem sometimes? So when you go from problem identification to problem analysis, what are the kinds of questions that you might use on your RTI team in different ways to get at what is the appropriate solution, or what is a good combination of solutions? Does the child feel connected and feel they belong at school? How does the child interact with other students? Right. So can you identify at least one adult in your building that every child has a connection to? Have you done that exercise? We've done that exercise too, particularly in pandemic. I'm not sure if it's been as successful for someone like my son, who was a ninth grader last year, 10th grader this year, making sure that everybody's connected to a trusted adult, especially if those trusted adults tend to be some of the same kids. Let's see, where does the child succeed? Yep, strengths-based focus is really a good space for whole child. How have you connected? Let's change that to have you connected with the family in any way to how have you connected with the family when it's already out the door, out of the space. And that was my, this goes off on maybe a little bit on a tangent, but the thing that's worrying me most about this space, and I think that's how I actually got maybe connected to Courtney originally, was a report that we had put out last summer in pandemic, because I was really concerned in Connecticut that I sit on a bunch of state level teams and folks were talking about all of these extra assessments that we needed to start adding into the school year on trauma informed spaces and kind of mental health spaces. And I was getting very worried about that, because some of that is putting the cart before the horse. So what professional learning was going to be in place for us to be able to use those assessment data well? Is it really justified in some of our settings? So Connecticut is a very strange state. We're like this tiny little state, right? With really diverse student populations. So our northeastern part of Connecticut is farmland, tiny rural towns that were not as impacted, or have not been as impacted by COVID as our what we call our Gold Coast towns, or our ones right outside of New York City, which experienced devastating losses. And so trying to say that the same trauma-informed assessment should be in place in every place, to me, was not a good use of resources, or it wasn't a way of thinking about what's needed for us to get the information we need. And so in that particular report that I had written, it said something like, you really need to think about what's the right tool. Maybe it's just adding a couple of questions to InfoSnap. I assume you all I feel like the world uses InfoSnap right now. The parent thing that you do in the beginning of the year, the parent forms, they're all electronic. Well, maybe you don't. So I used to get like the 3 color-coded sheets across my 3 kids, and I'd fill out the same information 3 times and send it back to the school. Now it's part of what's the Power School? The Power School platform is called InfoSnap. And so we do it all electronically, and you can carry over your data. Anyway, I said, how about if you just add 2 questions that asks the family, what's been your experience with this? And are you having any worries? That we need to talk about, or that we should. And then maybe we do a targeted screener with those kids that get flagged from home first. But anyway, that was a digression. I was just I'm worried about a lot of those types of things. I shouldn't say the word worry, right? Because I have active coping, and I use my active coping as much as I can. Okay, let me see what other folks said. Would a student questionnaire work? Yeah, actually, that's something that I'm working on. I did submit a grant this past year to really think about how do we change the way we think about screening? Because again, I do believe in an MTSS system. I believe in the early identification of academic problems, behavior problems, but I also think it's not very feasible to think that schools should be doing comprehensive screening in every one of these areas. all the time. We have to come up with a way to be more efficient in how we screen across pathways with an equitable lens. So I've been playing with that a lot. And there's some models in healthcare that I think could be adapted to education, but that's a couple of years out. So I'm sorry for that, but but we'll try to get there. But yeah, you could develop your own. Yeah, I can put the actual PowerPoint in there as well, if you need it. The slides, not just the PDFs, but yeah, I think you could develop a questionnaire to think about where are your biggest needs. So again, in some of my my Gold Coast towns, we're not worried about food insecurity as an issue that we need to be thinking about screening for. But in our New Haven schools, our Hartford schools, and some of our Northeastern schools that don't have access to connecting to places, maybe we do need to have that in place. But anyway, other questions? I forgot what time this actually ends. Is it 2:15 or was it 2:30?
Yeah, we had given about 15 minutes for.
Oh, so I'm 1 minute over. I'm sorry. I hate that on your Friday afternoon.
I think
You'd all be very unhappy. That's like the worst. I just broke every rule. Now I feel like I need to give you another COVID meme.
No, I would just love to just continue on with you. I have so many questions for you and see so many opportunities to extend some of the topics you're talking about. We're really ripe for some of this work, and I think in Maine we're experiencing, like, nationally, a phenomena of kids struggling and educators reaching for how do we respond best. And I think you've given us some ideas that are really appreciated, and I need to marinate a little bit so that I can gel my questions and come back to you, because I will be doing that. But
absolutely. And again, what we found, at least with our schools right now, is I thought we're going to be doing some things and we're really doing other things. And most of it is focused on emotional well-being. And honestly, the last principal academy that we had together, it was focusing on their emotional well-being. And so we're just backing off a lot of some of the things that we're doing to think about humor. So that's why I wanted to throw in the humor example for you too, because it's very simple and easy. You could build a contest with your students, right? Even.
Yeah, and with each other. It's an
important. And with it, yeah. Again, some of the memes you use in your staff meetings, some you don't use on the morning announcements, but they made me laugh.
Well, I want to just say a big Maine thank you, Sandy, for working with us as we tried to figure out if we were going to be in person and then flip-flop to virtual. And you have been agreeable and lovely to work with and very accommodating. So just a big thank you, and a nice kind of partnership developing too. So we're going to use you as a resource in your materials that you've shared. So thank you for that. Go ahead if you have comments or questions, and I'll continue to monitor that.